Namaste, and welcome to tonight's fireside on ESG. Is it the answer to sustainable investing? We're privileged tonight to be joined by Yajur Haria. Yajur is a CFA charter holder. He has a master's degree from the University of Oxford in mathematics and statistics, and he's currently VP at Reddington, specializing in sustainable investments. He's formerly the ex-president of NHSF UK, which is the largest Hindu student body outside of India. Yajur, it's a pleasure to have you with us here today. We're going to dive straight in today. So if this is your first time to Vicharamanthan, do check out the link below in the description for any information about us. And as usual, if you drop your questions in the chat, we'll have a chance to pose your questions to our speaker later on during the discussion. Yajur, welcome.
Namaste, Ravi.
Without further ado, let's dive straight in. So we're here to talk about ESG. Very briefly, can you outline for us what is ESG, what does it mean, and how is it used in the investment industry, which we're going to focus on?
Okay, I'll try and keep it brief, but it's really difficult, right? Because there's so much to unpack. With ESG investing, so ESG means, as an acronym, means environment, social, and governance. So that means corporate governance. And ESG investing is when investors think about the impact ESG factors have on their return or risk profiles, right, of their investments. In terms of how it's being used today, really we're at the start of trying to understand how ESG can be incorporated into our analysis and our decision making. But I suppose, like every other industry, we're in a phase of transition. And at the moment, what we're trying to do is really trying to understand what are the right metrics that we need to use to be able to make the right decisions, right? And so we're in a phase where we're trying to understand what are the right metrics, how should we measure them, and how should we utilize these metrics to make better investment decisions. And as a whole, and I think we'll touch on this a little bit later, but when we think about ESG investing, there is a whole spectrum. It goes all the way from investors that just simply don't take ESG factors into account, and there is still a large proportion of investors that do that, all the way through to impact investing, which is on the other side of the spectrum, where investors are willing to make some sort of reduction in their expected returns to allow for or to see some sort of impact on environment, social governance from their investment.
Brilliant. So let's stay with that. So you started with this sort of balance between risk and return, which is really where everything is going to fall in this industry. So what sort of impact are we presently seeing ESG factors have on returns and expected returns?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because I think that the perception is that if you're trying to do some sort of good in the world, you're going to lose out a little bit, right? And I think that's the perception. And it was really interesting because that was my perception as well a few years ago. But things have moved on since then. And what we're seeing is that there are a number of studies actually that are coming out that are showing that ESG factors may actually start to have a positive impact on your returns. So there was a study that was done, a meta study that was done by McKinsey a few years ago. So a meta study effectively means that they were taking into account, they were looking at 2,000 other studies, right? So it was a study on studies.
Yeah.
And those studies were basically asking the question, what is the impact of ESG factors on returns? And what they found was that something like 60% of those studies showed a positive return on investments, right? So that, and whilst only something like 8 or 9% showed a negative return. So
just to clarify, so 60% of investments that took ESG factors into account.
Yeah, 60% of those studies.
6% of the studies, okay.
Showed a positive return, or showed on average there was a positive return on investments
when taking into account ESG factors.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean that seems pretty strong. It's a little counterintuitive, as you said, because let's say let's say you're a fund manager and you're taking into account ESG metrics, and I'm a sinful fund manager who doesn't mind sort of vice investments. Then surely I have access to all of the investments that you have access to, plus some that you won't touch. So it seems a little counterintuitive that a ESG portfolio would outperform a sort of global open one.
Yeah, so I think that there's another way to look at it, right? So let's take G for an example, governance. Would you rather invest in a company that has a relatively stable, strong governance structure that also has a diverse board, or would you rather invest in a company that doesn't have a strong, stable governance structure that has a relatively simple or a less diverse board, right? So you're thinking white male over 70, and every member of the board being that. And what you start to realize is that ESG factors can actually be a relatively interesting indication of company resilience. So, for example, if you think about a company that takes into account environmental considerations, those companies are often likely to be less, they're less likely to be fined for environmental infringements.
Okay.
Right? Because they've taken those considerations into account in their strategy and within their purpose. Whereas companies that overlook those considerations may be more likely to be fined. And so suddenly you already have a return on that investment or on that factor in some sense.
This is really interesting because so I think there's sort of two assumptions that we're making here. So one is that companies that are sort of publishing and showing ESG figures and really taking them to account are earnestly doing so and are developing this resilience. And I think that's something we'll have to look at. And the other bit is that, well, still it's these ESG factors that are influencing risk and return. So at the end of the day, as long as I focus on those two, can I just ignore ESG? So I can look at these factors, but really only insofar as they impact how much money I make, how much profit is at the bottom line, which to some extent dilutes the importance of ESG.
I think in some ways, maybe, but I think the other way you can think about it is that these ESG factors are simply just another data point as well, right? The ESG factors are effectively a way of us assessing a certain part of a company, right? So whether those ESG factors, and climate change is a big topic at the moment.
Absolutely.
And so almost every organization in the world, or especially in the UK, is going to be looking at carbon metrics and carbon emissions. Yeah. Now, those carbon emissions, as well as post 2023, at least, there will be every company in the UK will have to publish some sort of plan as to how they expect to get to net zero. That data provides us an insight into the strategic thinking of that company and the strategic positioning of that company as the world transitions to net zero.
Yes.
And that is just one example, right? So climate change is just one example.
That's brilliant. I think that's a fantastic sort of coherent argument that you've given. So ESG is starting to come into the fore in the investment management space. We're starting to get better at measuring it, and I think we'll go into what measures it is. And because of that, what you're saying is it's starting to influence the way people run and look at companies. Yeah, okay. I think that's really interesting. We've got some interesting questions coming in on the YouTube chat. A few people, it's their first time being exposed to ESG. So hopefully they can keep up with us. We'll pick up some of their questions in a moment, but let's assume that this study by McKinsey is gospel, and ESG investments are outperforming, let's say, the base market or the other comparisons. Well, it seems like a win-win then. Surely I would take the ethical route that earns me more money, that makes me look good, and it makes me feel good inside, that I'm sort of saving the environment. Having said that, I read one of the studies, the questionnaires that Reddington did, and there was a difference between, let's say, attitude versus action. And I think we spoke about this previously. So to quote directly from the questionnaire, it said 63% of asset managers have made a climate commitment, but this is only translated to 39% targeting net zero at the strategy level. And you were talking about this. So why do you think that sort of dissonance is there?
Yeah, and you know, I think for me personally, I'm often disappointed by that, right? Because I often feel like there needs to be a greater onus, and words shouldn't just be words, but they should be they should mean something. And I really hope that gap starts to close. And there are a number of arguments to say that including or kind of thinking about or taking into account ESG factors does make a positive return, but it's not always straight and it's not always clear. And there is still often debate within the industry as to whether or not that is the case. And what you'll find is that the majority, or quite a significant proportion of investment consultants, but as well as that, investment professionals don't see it that way, and they often haven't got exposure to ESG factors and ESG factor integration, as well as the mindset that comes with it. So what you'll find is that whilst there is more and more research coming out, investment professionals are only starting to be exposed to it. And really, there is a clear need for greater education and greater exposure across the entire industry around the impact of something like this on investments.
So it's still in its early stages. So our audience at home that are saying, is this a new term? I've only just heard of it. Essentially, they're still at the cutting edge of what's going on in the investment sector. Is that fair to say?
Yes, in some ways. In some ways, right? So ESG has actually been around for centuries.
Okay.
And the way you think about it is that Christians and Muslims will often invest in such a way that aligns with their faith and their values. So they won't invest in alcohol, or they won't invest in prostitution, that kind of thing, right? So those kinds of exclusionary ESG funds exist. But really, that was the start. And what we're seeing is a rapid acceleration of the entire industry, and a real maturing of the industry.
So it's that confluence of my values as an individual and where I'm willing to put my money. Am I willing to put my money where my values lie? Yeah. Okay, well, let's stay with that because it's very important. So here on VM, we like to look at everything through a dharmic angle, a dharmic perspective. And the principles we use for that, there's a few key cornerstones that we'll use. So one is individual flourishing and societal flourishing. So is this good for me? Is it good for those around me? Is it good? Is it sustainable? Is it sustainable for me, for those around me, for the wider world? And the third thing is, does it promote this idea of liberty? And these are the three sort of cornerstones we like to use to say, is something dharmic? Alongside that, if you want to sort of start to refine it, perhaps we can consider the idea of minimum harm and maximum benefit, so sort of utilitarianism. So how closely, let's say these are my values, let's say as a Hindu and as someone from the dharmic traditions, these are my values. How closely are the current ideas of ESG aligning with the values that we just discussed?
Right. So this is where things start to get a little bit more complicated, but let's try and simplify as much as we can. And the reason why it gets complicated is because there are so many versions of ESG. So it's difficult to say that ESG as a whole aligns with dharmic values. You see, ESG is really a mechanism through which we can measure the impact on the environment as well as society from our investments. And the first step is to really understand what that looks like. So what is our impact? Now, the majority of people don't even know what their pensions are invested in, right? And that is a huge thing. So to go from that to then being able to understand what your pension is invested in, and then make intelligent decisions on how we should align our investments with our values, is really the trajectory in which we're seeing the industry go. And what I would ask of anyone listening today is to really understand what is your, first understand what is in your pension. The second thing is, it's really difficult to say, to say that that ESG as a whole aligns with dynamic values, because there are so many different types. But you will, if you look hard enough, there are a number of funds that you will see in the market that are genuinely trying to make some sort of difference. And so if you want to be on that end of the spectrum, you want to invest in a way that is impactful on the environment and society, there are funds out there that allow you to do that. But you have to do the research, and you have to know, you have to talk to asset managers or those that are managing your funds, so that you can understand what is it that you're investing in, and does that align with my values. And really that's maybe as far as I can take that, because it's difficult to say that the industry as a whole is aligning with Dharmic principles. What I would say is that there is more and more information and more data out in the industry that allows us to decide that allows us to make more and more intelligent investment decisions, and that becomes increasingly important. Now, the reason why I say that that's really important, and why it's important for us as Hindus, is, and I read this in a book by a couple of guys who are at Aviva, and I'll get that out at the end if anyone's interested in hearing it. But it's a book called Against Our Nature, and he talks about this concept called mental accounting, and how people are really bad at mental accounting. So if you want to, an example is, if you want to save water, if you want to reduce your water consumption, most people will think, okay, I'm going to take shorter showers. But what they'll do is they'll take a shorter shower, and then they'll go and have some sort of meat burger. Now, if you have a beef burger, that single beef burger is probably enough to offset the majority of shorter showers that you have for the entire year. But we don't think that way. And so that's why I say it's so important for us to get a little bit closer to the data and be a little bit more data savvy, so that we can start to understand what are the implications of our actions, so that we can make better decisions. And so that's why I kind of pivot there.
I think this is really good, because what we're talking about is extremely practical, and that's fantastic. So if I can kind of summarize, we're getting some great questions, so we'll go to them in a minute. So ESG is useful. It's a good starting point. It gives us data points. As individuals, we should really dive into where our pensions are, what they're doing, and then in all likelihood, we will have the responsibility, and we have to demonstrate the sort of intelligence to go and deep dive and really understand if these companies are aligning with our dharmic values. But you're saying there are some good ones out there. And to kind of wrap up this side before we move on to some questions is, let's say I'm really earnestly willing to do that. Am I going to have to be willing to sacrifice some return realistically? And I guess if I'm sort of very earnest, I should be okay with that. But, will I have to? And if so, to what extent, right?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It depends where on the spectrum you are. And there is a spectrum for anyone and everyone. So depending on how far you want to go, if it's simply that you want to know what you're investing in and you want to understand the impact of that, you can do that without necessarily sacrificing and probably enhancing your returns. You can then look to try and seek alpha, so alpha meaning kind of this additional return, or reduce risk by analyzing your ESG factors. Or you can be on the other end of the spectrum, which is impact investing, which effectively means that you're willing to sacrifice some returns. And that really, again, depends on the type of fund that you want to choose.
It's potentially really important. I think being okay internally sacrificing some returns to be aligned. It's not always the easiest, but it's quite important. I'm going to pick up a question here from Ajay Rayat, because it's very relevant. He's saying, is there a common framework in which to measure ESG metrics? And then is it fair to measure all funds with the same metrics? And And let's stay on the sort of how it's measured factors for a while, but let's start with Ajayji's question.
So it's a really difficult one. No, there isn't a common framework. There is a lot of discrepancy within the industry. There was some research done by Chatterjee and all, and effectively what he showed was that between different rating firms, so you're talking about MSCIs and your S&Ps. And
just for the audience at home, MSCI, just talk us through it.
So what they do is they go and effectively provide ratings for companies to assess how likely they are to be able to repay credit. So that's a credit rating, but they effectively go in and analyze different countries and provide ratings and information.
Sure. So during the financial crash, these were the guys that were saying this is an A bond, a B bond, A plus bond. Yeah. Exactly. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Sorry. Carry on.
But effectively, there is a metric called. There are a number of metrics that are effectively ESG metrics. Unfortunately, the correlation between these different metrics that should be showing the same thing was about 30%. It's relatively low. So effectively,
pretty poor. Yeah. So as an external. Yeah.
And the reason for that is that every organization, every rating agency has a different methodology, right? And you can say that makes the industry feel a little bit less credible. The alternative argument is that we're at a stage right now where we're still trying to figure out where we are in our journeys for climate change and diversity on boards and everything else. We're still at the start of that journey. And it's important, really important, to have healthy debate. And with healthy debate comes differences in opinion, differences in metrics. And by seeing and understanding what those metrics are and how they're calculated and understanding the assumptions that have gone in, that's really the start of a healthy debate in many ways.
So let's go into the nitty-gritty a little bit here. So can you give us some examples of ESG measurements or metrics that you think are good and are useful?
Yeah, sure. So at the moment, the kind of hot topic of the day is climate change. So a really simple one to understand is carbon emissions. And there are more and more companies that are now starting to disclose the carbon emissions that their company emits. But there are, again, nuances, and you have to think about this a little bit more. Is it enough to simply say that you will not invest in high emitting companies? No, because if you do that, so for example, if you own shares in an oil giant and you decide, actually, I want to reduce the carbon emissions in my portfolio, what you can do is you can decide to divest from that investment. You can decide to sell your shares. But the likelihood is that you're selling your shares to somebody that cares less about the environment than you do.
Absolutely. And they're getting them cheaper because you're selling them off.
Exactly. And so what impact does that have on the real world? Pretty negligible. Whereas if you're able to engage with the company whilst you own the shares, you're more likely to have some sort of positive influence. And that's what some of these larger asset managers like Legal & General and BlackRock are starting to do. And because of their size, they're really starting to have a significant influence in how companies are being run. But you started off the question by asking, are there good metrics? Now, that is a good metric, so long as you know and understand the implications of what that might mean on your investment and how to then utilize that information, right? So this again goes back to having data and knowing how to use it.
But let's stay with that metric. So we take carbon emissions. Now, ESG funds historically and even presently have been leaning and very tech sector heavy. And it's easy to see why. Somebody like Apple, Google, they don't necessarily have a lot of carbon emissions on their, let's say, carbon balance sheet.
Yeah.
But part of that is on how you choose to report it. You know, Apple doesn't actually produce any of its own phones, so the carbon emissions sit on a contractor's balance sheet. So then how good a metric is it really?
Agree. So there is definitely no perfect metric in the world at the moment. And there definitely needs to be more more work done in the emission space and in terms of what is disclosed. So sticking with carbon emissions in particular, and just kind of going into a little bit of the technicalities to help us understand what the problem is. Carbon emissions traditionally within investments, and I guess more generally, is split into 3 scopes, what they call scopes, right? So the first scope is effectively any emissions that are directly emitted by that company. So you're talking about through its processes, if they have company cars, for example, what are those emissions? The second scope is what emissions does the company emit based on the electricity that it uses. So for example, if they use renewable sources of electricity, those will be closer to 0. If they use coal power stations, they'll be significantly higher. Those 2 sectors, those 2 scopes are the scopes that are largely reported because they're the easiest to report. But like you say, they probably account for the smallest proportion of the actual emissions based on the company's actions and the products that it produces. You then have scope 3, which is basically everything else. So it goes from transportation, it is the use of any emissions from the use of product. So for example, if you're an oil giant, the emissions of burning that oil will fall into scope 3, not in scope 1 and 2.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
Right. Now, one of the things that needs to really be done is the mandatory disclosure of scopes 1, 2, and 3, so that people have a fuller picture of the actual emissions when they invest in a company. Again, that becomes difficult, right? Because scope 3, there are also overlaps, right, between different companies. So there has to be an intelligent way to make sure that we're not overcompensating or we're not overcounting or double counting the emissions in scope 3. So this is all really quite difficult, right? So I'm just trying to paint a picture of this is quite difficult, even though it sounds like it should be easy. It is quite difficult. But what we are doing is what we are seeing is a significant shift towards more and more companies disclosing the emissions that they produce and better data being available. And that is really the trend. As more and more data becomes available and better data becomes available, we'll be able to make more and more intelligent decisions.
So there's still a little bit of a challenge, and I think we're kind of getting there, because essentially the fundamental purpose and nature of the companies that are being invested in and the funds that are doing the investing is to generate profits and largely shareholder profits. So in 2019, the Business Roundtable got together and they redefined the purpose of a corporation. And they said, well, corporations are now no longer just for shareholder profits, they're also for society, to look after the customer, to look after the wider environment. Do you see that shift happening in reality, is the question?
Yeah. So I think so. And I think that what companies are slowly starting to see, and the shift is slow. So I'm not gonna sit here and say that it's happening overnight and next year we're going to see a significant shift, because that's not true. But I read a book recently by Mariana Mazzucato, and it was called The Value of Everything. So and it touches on that subject, the idea of what is value. And I think we have this preconception as investors, and that value means money, right? And value means price. But we're now starting to see a shift in we're starting to see a shift within companies and organizations that say that they're starting to take into account things like, what is the cost to natural capital within our business, right? So we're starting to see natural capital.
What do you mean by natural capital? So
sure. So natural capital is actually just everything within nature. So for example, the trees that you might cut down in a logging business, that will be part of natural capital.
Okay.
So what is the cost to natural capital within my business? what is the cost to society or the local community in my business? So, for example, if a hydroelectric company decides to build a dam, yes, it's generating renewable energy, but what is the impact on the local society? For example, if there is a village that depends on that water downstream, and what is the impact of that? What are the repercussions of any damages to that society on the company and on the on this hydroelectric company? So there is a shift in the dialogue towards a wider, more holistic discussion around value. It is starting to happen. I am keen and urgent for it. I'm urging for it to happen quicker because we aren't getting there quickly enough. We've just started the discussion on climate change when we recognize that, oh, there is an issue here. We need to start that discussion across all of the other ESG factors before we start to see more and more issues crop up. We shouldn't become a society that is simply reacting to what the world is telling us. We need to be a little bit more proactive, and that's what I'm hoping that we start to see. I think we're starting to see it a little bit, and I think that COVID has actually been a real wake-up call. There's been a real shift and a real kind of acceleration of progress in ESG since COVID started, but I really want it to move faster.
There's a bit of a challenge here, isn't there? This sort of, and this goes back to almost what we were talking about earlier. If you're a company that's earnestly trying to do this and make this change, let's take the river pollution that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. If you're a company that's earnestly trying to make that change and reduce your river pollution downstream, mm-hmm. It's either going to cost you something. You have to use different materials, or you have to use different machinery, or you have to then filter the water. It's going to cost you something. And because it's going to cost you something, it's going to reduce your profits, or it's going to increase the cost to consumer. And if I come along as a direct competitor to you and I say, well, I don't really care, then I can increase my profits, and therefore investors are going to be more interested, and I can go to market at a lower price. So is there still not a fundamental problem with the game that we're playing?
There is. And really, this is where two factors come in. So one is long-termism, where we need companies to start thinking about their long-term value, and not just what is the value that I can generate, or financial value I can generate within the next year. So for example, when let's take climate change again, because it's something that is very topical.
I think it's almost the most pertinent topic of the day.
It is.
It's not our generation.
If we think about climate change and the impact that it has on the company today, it's relatively minimal. But what companies are starting to do is start thinking about, well, how I want my company to still be around and be relevant in 100 years' time. How do I make sure that I make that shift? The second thing is, and really what is starting to make that, is starting to drive a lot of that change, is government really needs to intervene. And so what you might find is, and you're right, that if a company wants to, if there's a company that is trying to reduce its carbon emissions, it probably has to have some sort of input and really make an effort to innovate, and that costs money. And then the companies that don't innovate are probably likely to save on those costs. So what government can do is they can cut carbon taxes. Yes. So really starting to tax tax problems where, or tax the things where, I suppose tax to see the change in the world that they want to see, right? So to start to see and try and shift the mindset of these companies to a longer view by implementing some of these policy changes. And I guess taking it one step further, ultimately, it is people, societies, communities that are able to lobby governments to say, let's have what we want, and we need these changes now so that our future generations can continue to enjoy the world that we want them to have.
So let's stay there, because what you just said is quite interesting. Let's see if I've got it. So what you're saying is, yes, companies are making a change and they do genuinely want to go towards this. Investors genuinely want to go towards this and a sort of more value-based approach. But ESG is still developing. We're developing how we measure it, how we report it, and therefore how we interpret it. But it's getting better. Having said that, the game also needs to change. And that's hugely fundamental. And the way you're suggesting is some sort of carbon tax. And just talk us through how does that work? How does that fundamentally change the nature of the game if I let's say have to pay a carbon tax?
Okay, so let's take your car for example, right? So how much are you paying in petrol at the moment?
I have an efficient car, so probably top up once a month. So what is it, like 100?
And a liter would be what, 140, 150?
Yeah, something like that.
Right.
Yeah. Guilty of that, driving a diesel.
Yeah, it used to be what, £1, maybe less.
Yeah,
I remember, imagine if that was £2 or £3.
Okay.
Does an electric car suddenly start to become a lot more appealing? From a fuel perspective, maybe.
Possibly, yeah.
From an efficiency, from a financial perspective, it might sound a lot more appealing then, right? There are a whole bunch of other problems with electric cars, but if you want people to make a switch, carbon taxes are one of the ways in which you can do that. So, for example, if you apply a tax to your petrol to make it significantly more expensive, that could be one of the ways that people do that. Obviously, there is a balancing act, and this is what we saw at COP, right? There is a balancing act between the impact that we have on the environment and society. You see, the pledge that India made to net zero by 2070 had a real mixed reception, right?
Yeah.
So a whole bunch of people were saying 2070, that's far too late. It's 20 years well past 2050, which was the global kind of goal and aim. And what was really embedded and meant by the Paris Agreement. And then you have a whole bunch of other people that say, actually, this is a real fundamental shift because India has committed to net zero for the first time. And in doing that, committing to net zero by 2070, you have to realize that there was a real tug of war happening between making sure that India is on a trajectory to net zero and making sure that communities aren't left behind because we're adding taxes and we're making things more expensive. And that's really important for India because what they're trying to do is lift millions and millions of people out of poverty. And you can't do that if you're simultaneously making the general day-to-day cost of living more expensive.
So you just almost answered a question we've had by Manishji in the chat. He's saying third world nations have clearly laid out the historic argument for their slower approach to sustainability. And I think by that what he means, and Manishji, feel free to comment if we've taken the wrong approach, but that the West and the developed nations have historically used their industrialization, used lots of carbon emitting production methods to create their wealth. So it's not fair, it's not equal, it's not even vaguely appropriate to just be like, well, now you can't develop.
So I'd just like to comment on that. And it's really difficult and it's a really delicate situation. And I may say this at the anger of some people, and so I apologize. But we have to try and move past what has happened in the past, right? Because really, and if let's take the carbon budget as an example, right? Yes, we had a much larger carbon budget 200 years ago. But the reality is that today we have a certain carbon budget. And if we overshoot that, every nation and every country and every individual will suffer for it to some extent. What we have to do is try and facilitate nations supporting each other. And really, that's what a country like India needs. And this is what Narendra Modi said at COP, that yes, they will commit to 2070, but a lot of the onus of how we fund that still lies with the developed nations. In that he asked for $1 trillion to be invested each year to be able to fund that journey. And so they really if we really care about change, there has to be a concerted effort to work together to try and drive that change. It can't happen if we play a blame game and put the onus on individual countries to meet their targets on their own. That won't work. We genuinely need to work together.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a lot you're asking for in a way. You're asking for people to think beyond themselves, beyond their own nation as an identity. And that's quite interesting from a dharmic perspective, because the moment you start thinking beyond yourself towards your family, wider society, your nation, within a dharmic framework, essentially you're just starting to grow up. You're starting to look at stuff properly, with a bit more responsibility. But it's not that easy. It's not that easy. Like, yes, you can sort of develop your own, let's say, paradigm, but to do that ubiquitously is a challenge. And Mark Carney kind of pointed towards this in his speech, and isn't it 2019 to Lloyd's of London, and he called it. Well, there's two things he pointed to. So one is the individual horizon, that I only think about myself, and this kind of feeds into the second bit, which is the sort of timeline horizon. That, as you said, we have to start thinking longer term, 50 to 100 years. But as an investor, I want my portfolio to perform this year. As an asset manager, my end of year Christmas bonus is dependent on what my fund has done this year. As a CEO, my take home bonus is dependent on the profits I've generated this year. So how do we start to get beyond this individual, sort of very narrow individually and very narrow temporally mindset? How do we do that practically?
Yeah, so I love that speech, because and a lot of the phrases that he kind of coins come from the idea of the tragedy of the commons, right? So this idea that there will be certain individuals that abuse the resources that we have to the detriment of others without necessarily seeing that detriment, right? Now, and what he did within that speech was effectively to turn that, instead of saying that he wasn't talking about individuals in the same timeline, but on different nations or different continents, in different countries. What he was doing was he turned that into the timeline. He was saying that people of our generation today have absolutely no reason to stop abusing the resources that we are abusing for our lives. But what we are doing unknowingly is compromising the lives of generations that come ahead of us. And that is a difficult thing to comprehend unless, for example, you have a child. So I recently was blessed with a son, and that changes your perspective a little bit, right? You start to think about his future and his. I really do think about what will his life look like in 50 years' time, and I want to make those changes for him. But in terms of how we make that practical today, in terms of the investments that we make, it's really about thinking about using the right metrics, and understanding the risks that those metrics are associated with, in terms of the long-term value. So one of the big developments at the moment within the ESG space, the climate space for investments, is the wider scale use of forward-looking metrics. So we're talking about implied temperature rises. So effectively understanding based on the commitments of a company in terms of what they expect their carbon emission trajectory to look like. What is the implied temperature rise of the world based on that, and if the rest of the world follows suit, right? But what those kind of metrics help you do is understand the impact of your investments in a way that is more aligned with the language that you see in being used around the world at COP, etc. It also helps align investors with the policy changes and negotiations that were taking place at COP, for example. And that's what we need to start seeing across the spectrum of ESG. So what we need to see is the language that investors use better align with the language being used within negotiations and policy, etc. The metrics that we use, and I always keep going back to this because I really do think it is so important. The metrics that we use have to better align with what governments are hoping for, what communities hope for. And I think that will really start to allow investors, but also local communities, the global community, to get more involved in the discussions with companies and with organizations to say, you aren't doing enough, you need to do more. And if you don't do more, we will take action, and here are a series of actions that we are willing to take. So really getting involved with that dialogue, engaging with companies, and that is really important. So I come back to this point, right, that we talk about with pensions, right? So I mentioned earlier that how many people really know about what's in their pension. It's really important that we, one, know what's in our pension, but secondly, we start to engage with the companies and organizations that we invest with, because it's only that is their incentive, right? It is their incentive is to make sure that their company remains valuable, and ultimately you actually can control to some extent what that value looks like if you engage with these companies.
Yeah, so this is an idea that's a little bit controversial. I've heard two sides to this. So I've heard people say that changing where your pension is invested and making sure it's invested sustainably is one of the biggest things you can do in terms of having an impact on carbon emissions, on climate change. And on the other side, I've seen the argument put forward that, well, actually, it makes little to no difference anyway, unless we bring in these hardcore carbon taxes. Where on that spectrum do you fall?
I'm probably a little bit more optimistic.
Okay.
So I think that engagement works. I think that if you engage with companies, that it does lead to, and there are numerous studies again that demonstrate that engagement, if you engage with a company, you help to enhance their profits. Okay. And the value that they create. There are numerous studies that show that. But beyond that, engagement works. And that's why large asset managers like Legal & General, BlackRock, etc., are starting to turn the screw with companies and starting to engage much more, because what they want to see is to see results. And so what they are seeing, you're starting to see that engagement happen much more across the spectrum, and it will. I can only imagine that it will accelerate.
Yeah, I think so. For the Hindu community in the UK, I think we are per capita the richest diaspora community in England, and therefore we as Hindus have a lot of financial power. So essentially, what you're saying is we need to A, pay attention to where we're putting our money, and then B, engage with where we're putting our money. We should be not only aware of our power, but able to use it effectively and wield it.
Just a quick question, just a quick point on that. What we're not asking, and this is something, we're not very good at donating money, but I'm not asking people to donate money, right?
I will later on to well
But what I am asking is for people to invest smarter and invest in a way that's aligned with their values.
Brilliant. So grow your money, but grow it dharmically, grow it sustainably. I think we're having some fantastic questions. So definitely take a look at the YouTube after we finished. Our audience is clearly engaging. I think quite a few of them are starting to look at where should we put our pensions and investments. Now, no specifics, but there's a couple of points I want to pick up. So a couple of them are asking, if I wanted to start investing in ESG companies and funds, is there a central body or organization I can go to? So perhaps not specific funds, specific companies, but perhaps we can signpost to some good starting points if we're starting to look at ESG investing.
Yeah, sure. So there are a number of carbon trackers. So if you're thinking about climate change, there are a number of carbon trackers that allow you to track the carbon emissions of the companies that you're invested in. I think that we're still struggling with the data that is being published at the moment, but I think from 2023 onwards, which is what the UK government's commitment to having better disclosure in this country. From 2023 onwards, we will start to see a lot more disclosure publicly, just as we see with our financial accounts, etc. So there are carbon trackers that exist out in the market. Go to those first, and if you do a simple Google search, you'll find them.
Can you give us a few examples? It's fine. Give us a few names. It's okay.
Yeah, sure. What I can do is actually I can pick this up with what I can do is I'll pick this up on YouTube a little bit later.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, feel free.
Probably the best way to go.
That would be great. Okay, so Yajur is going to share that. We've got some great questions, so I'm going to try and get them in. We've got 10 or so minutes. So audience at home, do keep your questions coming in. They're great. We've got Arunji Taylor, and he's saying, what does the speaker have to say on carbon offsetting? Judy Ling Wong. So we had a discussion a few weeks ago, essentially said that net zero is not good enough and we need absolute zero. What do you think about that? Carbon offsetting is a huge industry.
So my personal take is carbon offsetting should be the last resort.
Okay.
Right? So it should be a last resort. Our first resort should be carbon reduction. So removing carbon from our emissions, from our day-to-day practices, etc. Because carbon offsetting is a technology that isn't fully proven at this stage. So when we see industries and companies integrating carbon offsetting into their net zero plans and their trajectories, it's really difficult for us to say how credible those plans are because they're based on unproven technology. And this I've highlighted a number of times to others, but I find frustrating when nations are effectively setting net zero targets, but continuing to fuel their coal mines, etc. But in reality, we need to be carbon free, not net zero. And you'll see more and more companies are starting to do that. So Google is a great example where they have been where they've been net zero for a while, and they're targeting carbon free by 2030. And in reality, our plan and our trajectory to net zero has to remove fossil fuels entirely.
And that's going to involve some changes to our lifestyle as consumers and beneficiaries of this sort of market.
The difficulty is that coal is cheap, right? And coal provides sustenance for those who are at the lowest rung of the financial ladder. In countries where they are barely struggling to have meals every day, coal is cheap. It's the cheapest fuel that they can get their hands on. So there is a real need for investment to help us innovate and reduce the cost of capital for each of these for the alternatives. And so, yes, we need to be carbon free. There's a lot of work for us to be able to get there, and there's a lot we can do to help people get there, especially those that are at the lowest rungs of the ladder.
Okay, I think we're kind of building a full structure. So we're getting to this idea of change has to happen. We're going to have to be willing to modify our lifestyle and the way we approach, indeed, corporations and investment completely. And there may be some pain involved, either in the form of a carbon tax or some form of penalties for not complying, that there, in all likelihood, we need some pain here to start to nudge the market properly. So very briefly, before we sort of move wholesale into this idea of what values could we start to use to guide us forward? Sorry, I've just lost my chain of thought here. So in fact, let's go into that and then I'll probably remember. So we've spoken about ESG and where that is and where sort of the dharmic values lie. Let's say we were looking for a pure ideal dharmic fund. What sort of investment values do you think it would bring to the table?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. The reason is that I think that I think sustainable funds that really help us paint a better picture of our wider impact, that go well beyond just climate change, but we're also talking about human rights, labor rights, diversity, that help us equalize the equation for millions of people around the world. Those are really the dharmic funds that we need to be investing in. And what I would strongly say is that we don't need a fund to be labeled dharmic for it to be dharmic. What we really need to do is understand the funds that align with our values, and continue to invest in them. And I think just more widely.
But what are the principles really? Because it's not quite that simple. Yeah. I mean, you and I were discussing offline, and you brought up the idea of you can invest in BP and still be ethical. And another example I came across was there was an ESG fund, and they refused, as a matter of policy, to invest in any companies involved in tobacco or nicotine products. And as a direct byproduct of that, they didn't invest in companies that basically specialize in quit smoking campaigns and quit smoking products, which you could argue is dharmic, is sustainable, is good for individual flourishing. So what sort of guiding principles would we start to use from an investing asset manager point of view?
Sure. So I think that maybe if we simplify a little bit, I think what we need to do is we need to start thinking firstly about ensuring that no human is harmed, right? So that no community is harmed through our investment, and that communities are equally compensated for their investment within that company. So what I mean by that is that every company, wherever it operates around the world, that derives some value from its local community. So ensuring that local communities and people are rightly compensated for that, ensuring nobody is harmed, no animals are harmed, that nature isn't harmed, right? I think what's really important is ensuring that. Another principle could be that we reduce we try and find ways to reduce the amount of material that we are consuming. So whether that be water, but also clothing material, whether that steel, concrete, whatever it is, finding ways to reduce that. So our general material consumption should be reduced. And we need to find innovative ways of doing that, whether that be through reuse campaigns, whatever that may be. So great organizations like Vintage, for example, so the buying and selling company, I think that they're great because what they're doing is they're encouraging people to reuse.
So I'm aware of time here. So if you could just summarize, so what would your, let's say, what would your 3 key principles be?
Okay, so let's say no harm, reduced.
No minimum harm. Let's assume some harm.
Let's say minimum harm, minimum waste, and greater education.
Oh, beautiful. Oh, that's a lovely one. Okay, great education.
And just simply that, you know, we all, the more aware we are, the more intelligent decisions that we can make in general, right?
Oh, I love that. Okay, brilliant. So minimum harm, minimum waste, and greater education. That's a really lovely one. Okay, I think we're running out of time. So I think our audience at home have engaged extremely well. So thank you very much for that. Hopefully you've enjoyed being on the platform.
I have. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.
No, absolutely. Hopefully we've pushed you a little bit. It's never an easy ride, but we appreciate your time and your insights. So thank you very much. Thank you to our audience at home. You've been great. Some really insightful, piercing and challenging questions, actually. So thank you. And we look forward to continuing this discussion. For our audience at home, if you've enjoyed this and you want to get involved, you can click on the link in the description or the link in the chat. You can get involved with our book clubs or indeed any of our chapters. If you'd like to contribute to Vichar Manthan, which is a voluntary platform, you can follow the link to become a well-wisher. We'd love you to donate just, you know, £2 or £3 a month, and really just feel part of the family and get involved behind the scenes. Do, you know, leave a comment, like, subscribe, and share if you've enjoyed this. Our next fireside will be coming up in 2 weeks, and you can see the slide on your screens there. It will be on dharma, religion, and freedom of expression in our society. So tune in on to that. It will be on YouTube live on this channel on Thursday, the 2nd of December. Namaste and good evening.